Today, there are over 8 billion humans inhabiting Earth, spread across cities, farmlands, mountains, and deserts. We have constructed towering skyscrapers, launched spacecraft to Mars, and developed the internet, exerting a level of dominance over this planet unmatched by any other species. However, a starkly different picture emerges if we rewind the clock to 900,000 years ago. At that time, a mere 1,280 humans remained alive globally. Not 1.28 million, not 128,000, but precisely 1,280 individuals capable of breeding. This tiny group represented the entire future of humanity, hanging by a thread so fragile, it seems almost miraculous that we exist today. If you're listening to this to help you fall asleep, that's precisely why I create them. So perhaps consider subscribing and let me know where you are and what time it is. I review the comments and see people in Berlin having breakfast and Boston preparing for bed, all occurring simultaneously. You know that unsettling feeling when you realize how narrowly you avoided disaster? Like when you brake suddenly and miss a truck by mere inches. That's essentially what happened to our entire species. Except it wasn't a split-second near miss. It was a harrowing 11,700 years of barely holding on. And here's the truly astonishing part. No one was aware this had occurred until the year 2023. Scientists had long suspected that humanity experienced a significant population decline in our ancient past. Our genetic diversity is unusually low when compared to other animals. Chimpanzees, who live in small, dispersed groups throughout Africa, possess far greater genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. This isn't normal. It's the unmistakable signature of a population bottleneck. But the severity of it, the fact that it nearly extinguished everything before it truly began, remained unknown. The narrative begins with a researcher named Wang Zhu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences 5 years ago. He was conducting genetic analyses on contemporary human populations to understand our evolutionary history, a standard scientific endeavor. He examined DNA from over 3,000 individuals worldwide, tracing mutations backward in time using a molecular clock. Then, he observed an anomaly in the data. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures appeared to collapse. It was akin to watching a film where 99% of the actors suddenly vanish from the screen. His mathematical models indicated a catastrophic event, but the sheer extremity of the numbers made him doubt their accuracy. He initially assumed it was an error, a glitch in his analysis. Because if these calculations were correct, then humanity's ancestors were reduced to a population smaller than that of a typical high school. He spent years meticulously rechecking and rerunning the analysis using various methods. Each time, the outcome was the same. 98.7% of human ancestors perished around 930,000 years ago, and the survivors remained at critically low numbers for over 100,000 years. This period of extreme scarcity lasted longer than modern humans have existed as a species. You might think, okay, so our ancestors faced hardship. Big deal. Species recover from near extinction all the time, right? Wrong. When populations dwindle to such small numbers, they typically don't recover. They perish. Mathematical models demonstrate that once a population drops to around 1,000 individuals, it enters what biologists term the extinction vortex. Genetic issues accumulate, Inbreeding becomes prevalent, and random environmental events can easily wipe out the entire group. Most species that reach such low numbers simply disappear forever. Yet somehow, our ancestors persevered. For 11,700 years, they clung to existence. Through ice ages, droughts, and the extinction of countless other species, a minute population of early humans spread across unknown regions, keeping the flame of humanity alive when it should have been extinguished. What makes this discovery even more extraordinary is its timing. The period around 900,000 years ago places us squarely in the midst of what geologists refer to as the early Middle Pleistocene transition. This was a time when Earth's climate experienced radical and unpredictable shifts. Prior to this era, ice ages followed a relatively predictable 41,000-year cycle. The planet would cool, ice sheets would expand, and then warm again. A challenging but manageable pattern. However, around 900,000 years ago, everything changed. The Ice Age cycles abruptly shifted to a brutal 100,000-year pattern. Glaciers became immense, covering vast portions of the northern continents. Sea levels plummeted by hundreds of feet, and ocean temperatures dropped dramatically. In Africa, the continent where our ancestors resided, the climate became incredibly harsh and arid. Imagine this scenario. You are an early human, perhaps a Homo erectus or one of their descendants, living in what was once a verdant woodland. Over generations, your environment transforms into a barren wasteland. Water sources dwindle. The animals you hunt become extinct, and plant life grows scarce. This deterioration is not temporary. It intensifies for thousands upon thousands of years. This is what scientists term a perfect storm for mass extinction. And indeed, it decimated most early human populations. They were wiped out. Only a small contingent somewhere in Africa managed to survive. We don't know their exact location, nor how they managed it, but they endured. Now the story takes an even more mind-boggling turn. During this bottleneck period, something unprecedented occurred within human genetics. Two of our ancestral chromosomes fused together, merging into one. This is the reason humans possess 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusion is an exceedingly rare event, occurring perhaps once in millions of years, and it happened precisely during our near-extinction event. This was not a mere coincidence. When populations are extremely small, unusual genetic alterations can propagate through the entire group much more rapidly than usual. If an individual possessed this chromosome fusion and survived to reproduce, their offspring would inherit it. In a population of just 1,280 individuals, a genetic change like this could become universal within a few generations. Today, every human on Earth carries this fused chromosome, all 8 billion of us. It is chromosome 2, and it holds the genetic imprint of those desperate 11,700 years when humanity teetered on the brink of oblivion. Scientists can pinpoint the exact location of this fusion and observe the molecular scars where two ancient chromosomes joined. It's like forensic evidence from the most pivotal event in human history. But the chromosome fusion did more than just reduce our chromosome count. Some researchers theorize it may have instigated changes in brain development. Genes located near the fusion site influence neural function. It's plausible that the genetic upheaval during the bottleneck contributed to the evolution of larger, more complex human brains. Consider this: our intelligence, our capacity for art, music, and technology, our ability for language and abstract thought. All of it might trace back to a genetic anomaly that occurred when there were barely 1,000 humans left on Earth. The evidence of this bottleneck is inscribed within our DNA like a time capsule. Every living person today carries the molecular signature of those 11,700 years of survival. Population geneticists can discern it in the patterns of genetic variation, the mathematical fingerprint of near extinction. However, for decades, no one could accurately interpret this signal. Earlier genetic analysis methods were akin to attempting to read a book through a keyhole. Scientists could detect that something significant had transpired in our past, but they couldn't grasp the complete picture. They knew humans had undergone at least one major population bottleneck, likely when our ancestors migrated out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. But they were unaware of an earlier, far more severe event. It required the development of advanced computational tools, such as the fit-coal method created by Wang Zhu and his team, to finally decipher the code. These novel techniques enable the analysis of thousands of genomes simultaneously and the tracing of genetic changes back nearly 1 million years. When Wang Zhu published his findings in the journal Science in 2023, the scientific community was astonished. This astonishment stemmed not only from the extreme severity of the bottleneck, but also from its remarkable duration. Most population bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively brief. A volcanic eruption might decimate a species, after which the survivors rapidly repopulate the vacant ecological niche. Or a disease might eliminate 90% of a population, with the remaining 10% recovering within a few generations. But 11,700 years is not merely a bottleneck. It resembles an extended near-death experience for an entire species. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, articulated this sentiment best. This would imply that the surviving population occupied a very localized area with good social cohesion for it to survive. Of greater surprise is the estimated length of time that this small group survived. If this is correct, then one imagines that it would require a stable environment with sufficient resources and few stresses to the system. In essence, somewhere in Africa, a pocket of stability must have existed, a refuge where a small group of early humans found all they needed to survive while the rest of the continent was ravaged by climate change. But where was this sanctuary? What made it unique? How did roughly 1,280 individuals manage to sustain a stable population for over 100,000 years? These are the questions that occupy scientists' minds. Some researchers hypothesize that the survivors resided near dependable water sources, perhaps in the vicinity of East Africa's Great Lakes, or along rivers that continued to flow even during periods of harsh climate. Water attracts animals, which in turn provide sustenance. Both water and food are essential for survival. Others believe the survivors had developed critical technologies that other human populations lacked. Perhaps they had mastered the control of fire more effectively. Fire revolutionized everything. It allowed for cooking, making nutrients more accessible. It deterred predators. It extended daylight hours, providing more time for work and social interaction. And most importantly, it enabled survival in otherwise lethal environments. Archaeological evidence indicates a significant increase in the use of fire by human populations around 800,000 years ago. This time frame aligns almost perfectly with the conclusion of the genetic bottleneck and the subsequent expansion of human populations. Is this a coincidence? Unlikely. However, here's a truly mind-blowing fact. The fossil record from this period is almost entirely absent. Between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, human fossils are exceptionally scarce in both Africa and Europe. For a considerable time, anthropologists referred to this as the fossil gap, unable to provide an explanation. Now we understand why. There were simply too few humans to leave behind fossilized remains. With only 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across vast, unknown territories, the probability of any of them dying in conditions suitable for bone preservation over hundreds of thousands of years was infinitesimally small. It's akin to searching for a needle in a haystack, except there are hardly any needles, and the haystack itself is continental in scale. The few fossils we do possess from this era are primarily from Europe and Asia, not Africa, suggesting they might represent human populations not directly involved in the bottleneck. It's possible the severe population crash only affected certain groups of early humans, while others in different regions managed to survive in slightly larger numbers. This makes sense when you consider the immense size and diverse climates and ecosystems of Africa. While some regions may have become uninhabitable during the climate crisis, others might have remained relatively stable. However, the genetic evidence is unequivocal. The ancestors of all modern humans, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, endured this extreme bottleneck. We are all descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every individual reading this carries DNA from that tiny population that refused to yield during the most severe climate crisis in human evolutionary history. Scientists estimate that approximately 65% of our total genetic diversity was lost during the bottleneck. This is an immense figure. For comparison, the well-known founder effect, which occurred when modern humans migrated out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, resulted in a genetic diversity loss of only about 15%. This reduction in genetic diversity has consequences we still experience today. It explains why humans are unusually susceptible to certain diseases, why our immune systems are relatively weaker compared to other primates, and why genetic disorders that would be rare in more diverse populations are relatively common in humans. In a peculiar way, our vulnerabilities are proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic susceptibility we carry is evidence that our ancestors possessed the resilience to survive when survival seemed utterly impossible. But the story doesn't end with mere survival. The most remarkable part is what transpired next. Around 813,000 years ago, a transformation occurred. The population of early humans began to rebound. Not gradually, but rapidly. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had spread across Africa and beyond. They developed new technologies, created more sophisticated tools, and became more adept at hunting larger animals. They began constructing shelters and utilizing fire in a more systematic manner. Crucially, they embarked on the evolutionary trajectory that would ultimately lead to three of the most successful species in human history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the enigmatic Denisovans. The timing is too precise to be mere coincidence. Genetic evidence suggests that the last common ancestor of all three species lived precisely around the time the bottleneck concluded. It's as if the near extinction event not only tested our ancestors' survival skills, but forged them into something new, something stronger, something more adaptable, something capable not just of surviving in a hostile world, but eventually dominating it. Ye Huanpan, one of the scientists who discovered the bottleneck, aptly summarized it. The novel finding opens a new field in human evolution because it evokes many questions, such as the places where these individuals lived, how they overcame the catastrophic climate changes, and whether natural selection during the bottleneck has accelerated the evolution of human brain. That last point is critical. Natural selection operating during the bottleneck. When population sizes are exceedingly small, evolution does not proceed as it typically does. Usually, genetic changes disseminate slowly through large populations. Beneficial mutations take hundreds of generations to become common, and detrimental ones take time to disappear. However, in a population of 1,280 individuals, evolution accelerates at an astonishing pace. Beneficial traits can spread throughout the entire group within a few generations. Individuals possessing even slight advantages in survival or reproduction can quickly become dominant in the gene pool. For 11,700 years, our ancestors were essentially subjected to an evolutionary pressure cooker. Only the most intelligent, resilient, and adaptable individuals survived to pass on their genes. Generation after generation, intense natural selection favored precisely the traits that would later define human success: problem-solving abilities, social cooperation, tool use, communication skills, and the capacity for rapid learning and adaptation to changing environments. All these attributes were likely refined and amplified during those years of near extinction. The genetic bottleneck was not merely an ordeal our ancestors endured. It was instrumental in shaping who they and we have become. But what did that period actually entail? Living through 11,700 years of evolutionary hardship. Let's travel far back in time. It is 930,000 years ago, and the world is ending. Not with a cataclysmic explosion or an asteroid impact, but slowly, brutally, one failed harvest after another. You are part of a small band of early humans, perhaps 30 or 40 individuals. Your species doesn't even have a name yet. Scientists still debate the precise classifications, such as Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis. What matters is that you are human enough that your descendants, thousands of generations later, will eventually become us. And right now, you are witnessing your world vanish. The forests where your ancestors hunted are transforming into scrubland. The scrubland is becoming desert. Rivers that flowed year-round are now seasonal streams, eventually reduced to dry beds marked by cracked mud. Your band is forced to move constantly, following water sources that continually dry up, pursuing herds that dwindle in size, chasing a diminishing hope. This isn't a mere drought. Droughts eventually end. This is the new reality. Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a dire configuration. Immense ice sheets are forming in the north, locking up so much water that sea levels drop by hundreds of feet. The Mediterranean Sea becomes a series of smaller lakes, and land bridges emerge between continents. However, it's not the ice itself that is decimating your people, but its effect on Africa. When massive ice sheets form in the north, they create an atmospheric dam, disrupting weather patterns that once brought regular rainfall to Africa. The monsoons that fed the continent's rivers become weak and erratic. What was once woodland transforms into grassland, grassland into desert, and desert into nothingness. Scientists have a term for what happened to Africa during this period: aridification. The continent didn't just get drier, it became catastrophically arid. Fossil evidence reveals that most of the large mammals went extinct. Antelope species that had thrived for millions of years simply vanished. Elephant populations plummeted. When the large animals disappear, everything else follows. Predators starve, scavengers starve, and any species dependent on hunting or scavenging, like early humans, faces a critical choice: adapt or perish. Most chose poorly. But your small band, your group of 1,280 individuals scattered across the continent, found something the others missed. Perhaps it was a mountain range that still received enough rainfall to support a few trees. Maybe it was an underground aquifer that sustained springs when all other water sources dried up. It could have been a rift valley that created its own microclimate. Whatever it was, it sustained you for 11,700 years. Now, let's consider what sustaining truly entailed. Discard any preconceived notions of human evolution as a steady march toward progress. During the bottleneck, there was no progress, only survival. Your band likely lived in groups of 20 to 30 individuals, extended families where everyone was related within a few generations. With only 1,280 breeding individuals in total, you couldn't afford to be selective about partners. Inbreeding was inevitable, and genetic disorders were likely common. Birth defects, developmental issues, reduced fertility, all consequences of an extremely limited gene pool. Yet somehow, you persisted. The daily existence was brutal. Wake up, find water, find food, avoid death. Repeat this cycle for 100,000 years. Water was paramount, always the first priority. In a landscape where most streams dried up for half the year, knowing where to locate reliable water sources meant the difference between life and death. Your people likely developed an almost intuitive ability to read the land, to identify signs of underground water, and to predict which seasonal streams would flow the longest. You might have learned to dig wells, perhaps simple ones created with sticks and stones. But even a rudimentary well that reached groundwater could sustain a family through a dry season. Food was more challenging. With most large game extinct, you could no longer rely on hunting as your ancestors had. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists, consuming anything available. Insects were a constant source of sustenance. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae. From a weight-for-weight perspective, insects rank among the planet's most nutrient-dense food sources, and their rapid reproduction rate allows for sustainable harvesting even from small populations. You consumed roots, tubers, and anything that grew beneath the earth, shielded from heat and drought. You learned which plants were suitable for consumption during various seasons, which ones posed a toxicity risk unless prepared correctly, and which could be preserved for times of scarcity. You became adept at locating eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, any source of protein. It's probable you learned to track certain animals to their nesting sites, timing your harvest to maximize yield without jeopardizing future breeding stock. And on occasion, when fortune smiled upon you, you found meat. Not the colossal woolly mammoths your ancestors hunted in large, coordinated groups. Those giants were long extinct. Instead, you found smaller creatures, a young antelope separated from its herd, an injured zebra, or an aging elephant succumbing to thirst. This is where the mastery of fire became indispensable. Early humans had utilized fire for countless millennia, but during this critical period, fire transcended mere utility. It was the very demarcation between existence and annihilation. Cooking meat rendered it safer to consume, eradicating parasites and bacteria that could decimate an entire family. More critically, cooking broke down tough proteins, rendering nutrients more accessible and allowing you to extract more sustenance from the same quantity of food. The cooking of plant matter proved even more transformative. Numerous roots and tubers are either indigestible or poisonous when raw, but when subjected to heat, they transform into significant sources of carbohydrates. Some scholars propose this era marked humanity's initial, systematic approach to processing plant foods. Beyond enhancing your diet, fire extended your active day. In the absence of artificial illumination, most creatures are incapacitated after dusk. Predators hunt, prey seek refuge, and life generally ceases until sunrise. However, with fire, your band could remain active well into the night. You could dedicate time to tool fabrication, shelter repair, and the exchange of vital information regarding water or food locations. Most importantly, fire facilitated the strengthening of social ties, which were paramount during this precarious period. With such small community sizes, conflict was an unaffordability. Every individual was invaluable. The loss of even a single adult to fighting, accidents, or illness weakened the entire group, and the demise of several individuals could spell doom during the subsequent lean season. Consequently, you cultivated cooperative skills that would rival those of modern diplomats. You learned to share resources even when they were exceedingly scarce. You mastered the art of resolving disagreements without resorting to violence. You learned to tend to the sick and injured rather than abandoning them. Most critically, you learned the power of shared knowledge. When one person discovered a new water source, the entire group benefited. When someone devised a method to detoxify a plant, rendering it edible, that knowledge disseminated instantaneously. When hunters developed novel tracking techniques, they quickly became common practice within days. This was not mere altruism. It was a fundamental survival strategy. In such a diminished population, the loss of accumulated knowledge through the death of an individual could prove catastrophic. Thus, you developed oral traditions, pedagogical methods, and systems for transmitting information across generations. You became remarkably diligent in educating children, not only in basic skills, but in a comprehensive understanding of your environment, locating water sources throughout the year, identifying safe flora, interpreting animal tracks, predicting weather patterns, and mastering tool creation and maintenance. Children who absorbed knowledge rapidly possessed enhanced survival prospects and a greater likelihood of reproduction. Over thousands of generations, This process selected for intelligence, for pedagogical aptitude, and for the capacity to acquire and convey intricate information. You were evolving into something entirely new. Genetic evidence suggests that, during this critical period, human brain size began to increase, albeit not dramatically at that stage. Significant growth would follow later. The cranial capacity of human fossils, dating from shortly after this bottleneck, is noticeably larger than those predating it. This development is logical. When survival hinges on outsmarting one's environment, natural selection inherently favors larger, more capable brains, even if these larger organs demand more energy, a resource that was desperately scarce during the crisis. However, it wasn't solely raw intelligence that underwent evolution. It was specifically social intelligence. Living in minuscule groups for millennia, you became exceptionally adept at deciphering others' intentions, predicting their actions, knowing when to extend trust, when to exercise caution, when to share, and when to withhold. You developed what psychologists term a theory of mind, the capacity to comprehend that others possess distinct thoughts and intentions from your own. While seemingly straightforward, this is one of the most complex cognitive abilities within the animal kingdom, and you honed it under the most extreme survival pressures imaginable. The archaeological record from this epoch is regrettably sparse, yet the limited evidence is compelling. Tools became more sophisticated and also more standardized, suggesting that small groups were developing consistent manufacturing methods and widely disseminating these techniques. Stone tools from the latter part of the bottleneck period exhibit what archaeologists refer to as cultural convergence, where similar designs emerge in disparate regions around the same time frame. This points to communication networks between groups, trade routes, and possibly even regular congregations, where bands would convene to exchange not only goods, but also knowledge and genetic material. Because these 1,280 breeding individuals were not concentrated in a single location, basic population genetics dictates they must have been dispersed. If 1,280 individuals were confined to a single valley, a solitary catastrophe, a flood, drought, disease outbreak, or volcanic eruption could eradicate them all. Evolution does not operate with such inherent vulnerabilities. Therefore, they were scattered, perhaps in groups of 20 to 30 individuals, separated by hundreds of miles, interconnected by kinship ties and trade, but maintaining sufficient independence such that no single event could annihilate them entirely. This established what biologists term a meta-population structure. Individual groups would experience growth and decline, sometimes becoming extinct and being replaced. Yet the overarching network would persist. It resembles a game of whack-a-mole, where the moles represent human populations and the hammers are environmental adversities like droughts, diseases, and climatic shifts. Some groups would falter and vanish, while others would endure, reproduce, and dispatch migrants to repopulate vacant territories. For 117,000 years, this arduous struggle continued. Certain generations likely experienced periods of relative prosperity, discovering advantageous territories with dependable resources. Others endured profound hardship, witnessing the loss of children to starvation and illness. Yet, somehow, the network endured. Then, approximately 813,000 years ago, a transformation occurred. The initial indicators were subtle: slightly more consistent rainfall in certain areas, grasslands beginning to re-expand after millennia of desertification, and animal populations gradually recovering. The most severe phase of the climate crisis was subsiding. However, by this juncture, your people were no longer the same species that had entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of intense natural selection had fundamentally altered them, enhancing their intelligence, cooperative abilities, and overall adaptability for survival in challenging environments. They had developed technologies that would have appeared miraculous to their ancestors: superior tools, more refined fire management techniques, and improved food processing methods. Most significantly, they had cultivated social systems capable of sustaining cooperation and knowledge dissemination across multiple generations. As the climate began to ameliorate, they were prepared. Population growth became explosive. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of the bottleneck survivors had spread throughout Africa and commenced their expansion into Europe and Asia. They carried with them the accumulated survival skills honed during the crisis, alongside the genetic and cultural adaptations that had ensured their continued existence when extinction seemed imminent. These were not merely any humans. They were individuals forged in the crucible of the most severe environmental crisis in our species' history. They were the progenitors of every human who would follow. Every person alive today carries genes that successfully navigated 117,000 years of near annihilation. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We are all descendants of those survivors, products of the bottleneck, living testament that sometimes, when all seems lost, a few individuals can possess the resilience to preserve hope until the world once again becomes habitable. However, this chapter was merely the beginning. What transpired next would alter everything. Envision this: your ancestors have just weathered the most catastrophic climate event in human history. For over 100,000 years, they lived precariously on the brink of extinction, their existence consisting of tiny scattered groups across Africa, clinging to any available refuge. Then the rains returned, not uniformly or instantaneously, but gradually, year by year, the grasslands began to regenerate. Rivers that had remained dry for millennia started to flow anew. Animals that had vanished from vast territories reappeared in modest herds. And your people, your battle-hardened, climate-tested, evolutionarily refined people, surged across the landscape with unprecedented force. Within a mere few thousand years, an insignificant span in evolutionary terms, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had multiplied into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. They dispersed from whatever corner of Africa had sheltered them during the crisis, embarking on the colonization of territories that had lain dormant for ages. But here's where the narrative takes a truly astonishing turn. Their expansion was not a monolithic surge of a single, unified human family. The genetic bottleneck had initiated a process unprecedented in human evolution, setting the stage for the most significant speciation event in our lineage. Approximately 800,000 years ago, this singular population of survivors began to diverge into three distinct groups, embarking on three separate evolutionary trajectories that would eventually give rise to the three most successful human species in history, the enigmatic Denisovans. Now, speciation typically unfolds over hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years. Species diverge gradually, accumulating differences generation by generation until they are no longer capable of interbreeding. However, the bottleneck compressed and accelerated this process. Those 117,000 years created a kind of evolutionary spring-loading. When the population finally expanded, it erupted in multiple directions simultaneously. Imagine forcing a river through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. Immense water pressure builds. Then suddenly the constraint is removed, and the water doesn't merely flow. It erupts in every direction, carving new channels and forging new pathways. This is precisely what occurred with human evolution in the aftermath of the bottleneck. The first group remained in Africa. These would eventually become the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens, though they were not yet fully modern. They were still evolving, still refining the survival strategies that had seen them through the crisis. The second group migrated northward and westward into Europe and Western Asia. These populations encountered a world vastly different from that known by their ancestors. Colder, more seasonal, presenting both novel challenges and opportunities. They adapted swiftly. Within a few 100,000 years, they had developed the robust physiques and large nasal passages and cold weather adaptations that would make them perfectly suited for Ice Age Europe. They became the Neanderthals. The third group ventured eastward, spreading across Asia, and eventually reaching as far as Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them due to their sparser fossil record, but their existence is confirmed by the presence of their DNA in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. They were the Denisovans. All three groups carried the genetic imprint of the bottleneck: the fused chromosome, the reduced genetic diversity, and the neural adaptations selected for during those arduous 117,000 years. However, they also began to develop their own unique characteristics. The African population that remained behind faced an environment that was recovering but still demanding. They required adaptability and innovation, the capacity to exploit a wide range of resources. As the climate continued its fluctuations, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving skills, and the ability to rapidly develop new technologies in response to changing conditions. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed what we now recognize as the defining traits of modern humans: larger brains relative to body size, more gracile bone structure, and an enhanced capacity for symbolic thought. Most importantly, they developed what anthropologists term behavioral modernity, the ability to create art, employ symbols, and engage in abstract reasoning, the mental toolkit that would eventually enable them to dominate the planet. But that future was still distant. For the present, they were but one of three human species, all vying for resources in a world still recovering from the most devastating climate disaster in human history. Meanwhile, the Neanderthals were evolving into something distinct. Migrating into Europe during the recovery period, they encountered environments that remained brutally cold and highly seasonal. Winters could extend for 8 months, while summers were brief and unpredictable. They adapted by becoming extraordinarily robust. Neanderthal skeletons reveal bone density and muscle mass that would impress modern bodybuilders. They developed massive nasal passages to warm and humidify the frigid, dry air they inhaled. Their brains actually surpassed those of modern humans in size, possibly as an adaptation to the complex demands of surviving the Ice Age. Yet, their most remarkable adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became master hunters, not merely opportunistic scavengers like many of their predecessors, but systematic, strategic predators capable of bringing down colossal Ice Age mammals. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques and learned to hunt cooperatively, herding large animals into designated kill zones. They mastered the preservation of meat through extended winters, likely utilizing natural refrigeration within caves and permafrost. Most notably, they developed the earliest systematic burial practices in human history. Neanderthal graves show evidence of intentional placement, sometimes accompanied by grave goods, suggesting the development of symbolic thinking, the capacity to perceive death as meaningful and worthy of ritual. They were no longer merely surviving, they were forging culture. The Denisovans were engaged in similar developments in Asia, though their achievements are more challenging to trace. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations reveals Denisovan DNA from the Philippines to Tibet, indicating their extensive range across diverse environments. Some Denisovan populations adapted to high altitudes, developing genetic variations that facilitated more efficient oxygen processing in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. These same genetic variants are present in modern Tibetan populations today, evidence of interbreeding between ancient humans and Denisovans, passing on survival genes that continue to assist people in extreme altitudes. Other Denisovan groups appear to have been skilled seafarers. Evidence suggests they reached islands in Southeast Asia, a feat requiring sophisticated boat building and navigation skills, implying the development of maritime technologies thousands of years before any other human species. However, what is truly extraordinary about all three groups is their continued connection. Despite their dispersion across three continents and adaptation to radically different environments, they remained genetically similar enough to interbreed when their territories overlapped. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred when our ancestors finally departed Africa around 60,000 years ago. Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans at various times and locations. Genetic evidence points to multiple instances of interbreeding over hundreds of thousands of years. This reveals something profound about the bottleneck and its consequences. Those years of near extinction had forged a kind of genetic unity among all human populations. Despite evolving along divergent paths for hundreds of thousands of years, we remained fundamentally the same species, all bearing the chromosomal fusion that marked us as bottleneck survivors, all sharing the basic genetic toolkit refined during those desperate millennia. Yet each group also developed its own specialized survival strategies. The archaeological record from this period showcases an explosion of technological innovation, not confined to a single group, but evident across all three. In Africa, stone tool technology grew increasingly sophisticated. The simple choppers and hand axes that had dominated human toolkits for millions of years were replaced by meticulously crafted spear points, scrapers, and cutting implements designed for specific tasks. More importantly, tool making became standardized. Archaeological sites across Africa reveal remarkably similar tool designs, suggesting widespread communication and knowledge sharing between groups. This is the hallmark of true cultural evolution, where ideas spread faster than genes, enabling rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals were developing their own technological traditions. They created the first hafted tools, attaching spear points and knives to wooden handles using plant resins and animal sinews. This might seem simple, but it represents a significant cognitive leap, requiring foresight, the gathering of multiple materials, and an understanding of abstract concepts like hafting and leverage. They also developed what archaeologists term prepared core techniques for stone tool manufacture. Instead of simply chipping away at rocks until a usable object was formed, Neanderthals learned to meticulously shape stone cores to produce multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material. This signifies manufacturing, planned systematic production of standardized goods. The Denisovans were also innovating, though their achievements are harder to document. However, genetic analysis suggests they were the first human species to systematically utilize plant-based medicines. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan gene variants that aid in processing plant toxins, indicating their ancestors had learned to use poisonous plants medicinally, developing resistance through natural selection. They may also have been the first humans to practice systematic agriculture. Some researchers posit that the genetic variants enabling the digestion of starchy foods in modern Asian populations originated with Denisovans who had learned to cultivate and process wild grains. But perhaps the most significant innovation occurred in the realm of social organization. All three post-bottleneck human species were developing increasingly complex social structures. Extended family groups formed alliances with other groups, and trade networks emerged, facilitating the movement of raw materials and finished goods over hundreds of miles. This was no longer merely about survival. It marked the dawn of civilization. The genetic evidence for this social revolution is inscribed within our DNA. During the post-bottleneck expansion, human populations exhibit patterns of what geneticists call structured breeding, indicating not random mating, but systematic exchange of marital partners between groups. This suggests our ancestors had developed kinship systems and rules governing mate selection, likely involving elaborate gift exchange networks that maintained relationships between distant communities. They were forging the social bonds that would ultimately permit human communities to grow from small kin groups to more complex structures like tribes, chieftainships, and eventually nations. Yet, they were also cultivating something else entirely, a development that would prove even more consequential in the long term: language. Precisely when human speech emerged remains an enigma. It leaves no fossil record, and its genesis can only be surmised from indirect indicators. Nevertheless, all evidence suggests that the period following the demographic bottleneck was when human communication achieved true sophistication. The rapid dissemination of standardized toolmaking techniques points to the conveyance of intricate information. The existence of trade networks implies negotiation and abstract thought processes. The burial rituals of Neanderthals offer insights into symbolic cognition. Most compellingly, the genetic bottleneck created precisely the circumstances where complex language would confer the greatest advantage. small dispersed populations, striving to maintain contact over vast distances, groups requiring the exchange of detailed intelligence concerning provisions, threats, and opportunities, individuals whose continued existence depended on their capacity to rapidly acquire sophisticated skills and impart them to their offspring. In these conditions, any enhancement in communicative ability would offer significant survival benefits. Those capable of articulating more clearly, comprehending with greater precision, or transmitting information more effectively were more likely to endure and procreate. Over countless generations, this selective pressure would refine human communication skills to a degree far exceeding that observed in any other species. By the time the three human species re-encountered one another, modern humans meeting Neanderthals in the Middle East, and Denisovans interacting with both groups in Asia, they possessed the capacity for highly developed verbal communication. They could share knowledge, broker alliances, and even recount tales of their ancestors who had persevered through the catastrophic die-off that occurred 900,000 years prior. However, new challenges were also emerging. The world was becoming repopulated. Resources that had been plentiful during the recovery phase were now subjects of contention, and the three human species were beginning to vie directly for the same territories and the same resources. The era of collaboration was drawing to a close. The era of competition was on the cusp of commencing. Then came the pivotal encounter that would determine humanity's destiny. 60,000 years ago, the descendants of those African survivors finally departed their home continent. Not all of them, but a select group, perhaps a few hundred individuals, who made the decision to traverse the narrow straits separating Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. They were entirely unaware that they were about to encounter their long-lost relatives. For over 400,000 years, the three human species had been evolving in isolation. Modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, and Denisovans in Asia, each had become supremely adapted to their respective environments. Each had developed its own distinct technologies, its own unique cultures, its own methods of survival. Now they were poised to meet face to face. The initial contact likely occurred somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps along the eastern fringes of the Mediterranean Sea, where African migrants would have encountered the southern reaches of Neanderthal territory. Envision that moment. You are a modern human, part of a small exploratory band, venturing into new lands. Your people have never encountered other humans who appear different from yourselves. Then, abruptly, you perceive them across a valley. They are human, yet not entirely so. Shorter and more robust than your people, faces that jut forward with formidable brow ridges and immense nasal cavities. Bodies built like professional wrestlers, all muscle and dense bone. Neanderthals. Your immediate impulse might be fear, or curiosity, or aggression. We will never ascertain the precise nature of those initial meetings, but we know what transpired subsequently, for it is inscribed within our DNA. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals did not merely engage in territorial disputes. They formed connections. They procreated together. Genetic analyses reveal a history spanning millennia. Today, every individual of non-African descent carries approximately 2% Neanderthal DNA. This is the genetic marker of those ancient encounters, tangible proof that when our species met, at least on occasion, They opted for accord over conflict. Yet, accord has its limitations. The Middle East during this epoch functioned as a revolving door for different species. Climates would shift, prompting modern humans to expand northward. The climate would change once more, leading Neanderthals to press southward. For tens of thousands of years, the region repeatedly changed hands. At times, modern humans held dominion over the most productive hunting grounds. At other times, Neanderthals did, but neither species could establish lasting supremacy until a transformative event altered the very dynamics of their coexistence. Approximately 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists term the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit, a groundbreaking array of technologies that rendered them far more proficient hunters and gatherers. Sophisticated spear throwers capable of launching projectiles with deadly precision. Bone needles that enabled the creation of tailored garments for protection against the cold. Fish hooks and nets that unlocked access to aquatic food sources. Crucially, they mastered systematic blade production techniques, allowing for the crafting of long, sharp cutting edges from minimal quantities of stone. These were not merely improved implements. They were force multipliers, technologies that empowered smaller human groups to achieve feats previously requiring much larger numbers. A Neanderthal hunting party might need 20 individuals to fell a mammoth. A modern human contingent, equipped with spear throwers and coordinated tactics, could accomplish the same task with 8. This enhancement in efficiency accumulated over time. Modern humans could sustain larger territories with smaller populations. They could inhabit marginal environments that would challenge even the robust Neanderthals. They could penetrate new regions more swiftly and establish permanent settlements with greater ease. The Neanderthals, who had weathered the Ice Age through sheer physical resilience and strong group cohesion, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered by a more technologically advanced species. However, they did not capitulate without resistance. Archaeological findings from this era indicate escalating violence between human groups. Neanderthal settlements exhibit a greater prevalence of weaponry. Modern human sites reveal evidence of defensive structures. Skeletal remains bear the distinct marks of interpersonal conflict. This was not an act of extermination, but rather a struggle for identical resources by two species sufficiently alike to desire precisely the same things: water sources, hunting territories, shelter locations, raw materials for tool production. Increasingly, modern humans emerged victorious. Not due to superior strength, Neanderthals were physically more formidable in nearly every respect. Nor due to greater intellect, Neanderthal brains were, on average, larger. They triumphed because of their greater adaptability. Neanderthals had dedicated hundreds of thousands of years to perfecting survival strategies for Ice Age Europe. They were exceptionally skilled at their established methods, but these methods were highly specialized. Modern humans, products of the African recovery period, had been selected for their capacity to adapt. They could swiftly alter their tactics in response to changing circumstances. They could exploit novel food sources. They could modify their tools and techniques to confront unfamiliar challenges. When the climate shifted, as it did with relentless frequency during this epoch, modern humans adapted. Neanderthals, entrenched in successful but rigid survival strategies, encountered escalating difficulties. Neanderthal populations began to decline. Initially, they relinquished their prime territories, river valleys, coastal regions, the most productive hunting grounds. Subsequently, they were relegated to more remote areas, mountain valleys, northern forests, locales not yet desirable to modern humans. By 28,000 years ago, the final Neanderthals resided in southern Spain and Gibraltar, isolated pockets clinging to existence in ever-shrinking refuges. Then, they vanished. The narrative in Asia followed a similar trajectory, albeit with distinct nuances. Modern humans encountered Denisovans around 50,000 years ago. Our understanding of these interactions is less comprehensive due to the extreme rarity of Denisovan fossil finds. Much of our knowledge stems from genetic analysis, yet the DNA paints a clear picture. Similar to the Neanderthal encounters, interbreeding occurred. Contemporary Asian populations exhibit Denisovan genetic variations. Some island populations in the Pacific possess up to 6% Denisovan ancestry. In contrast to the European scenario, direct competition between modern humans and Denisovans in Asia appears to have been less pronounced. The continent's vast expanse allowed different groups to inhabit distinct ecological niches for extended durations. Denisovans, adapted to high altitudes, continued to reside in mountainous regions. Those who had become proficient seafarers maintained control over archipelagos. Modern humans initially occupied separate territories, river valleys, coastal plains, areas that complemented rather than directly contested Denisovan domains. However, ultimately, the same technological and demographic pressures that led to the extinction of Neanderthals began to impact Denisovans as well. Modern humans were simply more adept at resource exploitation. They could sustain larger populations within equivalent territories, expand more rapidly, and establish new settlements with greater ease. One by one, Denisovan populations were assimilated, outcompeted, or displaced. Some may have persisted until surprisingly recent times. Intriguing genetic evidence suggests that modern humans encountered Denisovans in Southeast Asia as recently as 25,000 years ago. But eventually, they too disappeared as distinct groups. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, or modern humans, stood as the sole surviving human species on Earth. The descendants of those 1,280 bottleneck survivors had outlasted their evolutionary kin, who had also originated from the same ancestral lineage. The tripartite division that commenced 800,000 years earlier had reached its conclusion. But why did modern humans prevail where Neanderthals and Denisovans faltered? The answer leads us back to the bottleneck. Years of near extinction had fostered the selection of highly specific traits in all three species: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, and adaptability. However, the African population, the progenitors of modern humans, had faced an additional challenge that their European and Asian counterparts had largely avoided. Africa had remained climatically volatile even after the most severe phase of the crisis had passed. While Neanderthals adapted to the predictable rhythms of Ice Age Europe, and Denisovans specialized for particular Asian environments, modern humans were compelled to continuously adapt to ever-changing conditions. Decades-long droughts interspersed with periods of flooding, seasonal cycles that shifted every few generations, unpredictable fluctuations in animal populations. This persistent environmental pressure maintained a level of evolutionary flexibility in modern humans that extreme specialization had not. When the three species finally encountered one another, Neanderthals and Denisovans were akin to finely tuned racing cars, exceptionally efficient under optimal conditions, but difficult to adapt to new demands. Modern humans, by contrast, were more like all-terrain vehicles, not perfectly optimized for any single environment, but capable of navigating whatever challenges arose. This adaptability manifested in numerous ways. Technological innovation. Modern humans consistently introduced new developments, devising novel tools and techniques every few thousand years. Neanderthals, conversely, employed essentially the same lithic technology for over 200,000 years. It was effective, so they adhered to it. Social organization. Modern humans established larger, more intricate social networks. They could mobilize greater numbers of individuals for significant hunts or territorial conflicts. They cultivated trade relationships that facilitated the movement of resources over hundreds of miles. Demographics. Modern human populations exhibited a greater capacity for rapid growth and swifter recovery from setbacks. When disease or climatic catastrophes reduced a group's numbers, they rebounded within a few generations. Diet. Modern humans evolved into extreme dietary generalists, consuming a wide array of foods from shellfish and mammoth meat to processed plant-based items. Neanderthals, however, remained primarily focused on hunting large game, effective yet vulnerable when climatic shifts impacted prey populations. But perhaps most significantly, modern humans had developed more sophisticated communicative faculties. The genetic bottleneck had imposed selective pressure for complex language across all three species. However, modern humans, contending with more variable environments and larger social structures, had pushed the boundaries of verbal communication furthest. They could coordinate large group activities with greater efficacy. They could disseminate complex technical knowledge with enhanced accuracy. They could sustain interpersonal relationships across greater geographical expanses and extended temporal periods. When modern humans encountered Neanderthal or Denisovan groups, they were not merely competing for resources. They were engaged in a contest with a communicative and organizational advantage that had been developing for 400,000 years. It was an uneven contest. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had colonized every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture, established permanent settlements, and cultivated complex societies. The population that had once numbered only a few hundred individuals now comprised millions, speaking hundreds of distinct languages. They had inherited all the survival skills that had guided their ancestors through the bottleneck. But they had also cultivated something novel, something their evolutionary cousins had never fully achieved: the capacity not merely to adapt to their environment, but to fundamentally reshape it. The era of human ascendancy had dawned, and it all traced back to those desperate millennia when survival hung precariously by the slenderest of threads, and somehow, impossibly, 1,280 individuals refused to yield. So here we are, 8 billion humans. Look around and you see Tokyo with its 14 million inhabitants in the metropolitan area, Lagos with over 15 million, New York, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, cities so immense they are visible from orbit, shining like galaxies against the dark expanse of the planet. We have constructed the internet, linking every corner of the globe. We have sequenced the human genome. We have dispatched robotic probes to Mars and sophisticated telescopes to the very edge of the universe. We have created art that evokes tears and music that compels strangers to dance together. We are demonstrably the most successful species in the history of life on Earth. And every single one of us, every person reading this, every child currently being born, every human who has ever lived, carries the genetic legacy of those 1,280 individuals who refused to surrender 900,000 years ago. This is the aspect that gives one pause when truly contemplating it. Your DNA contains sequences that endured the most severe climatic catastrophe our lineage has ever faced. Genes that were tested through 117,000 years of near extinction and emerged victorious. Chromosomes that fused under immense pressure, somehow rendering us more resilient. The very way your brain functions, your problem-solving methodologies, your capacity for cooperation with strangers, your acquisition of language, your nurturing of your children, all of it was shaped by those desperate millennia when survival demanded every conceivable advantage. You are living testament that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. But this revelation offers more than just a fascinating origin narrative. It elucidates a great deal about the fundamental nature of humanity. Have you ever pondered why we exhibit such a superior capacity for cooperation compared to other primates? Why we can collaborate in groups of hundreds or thousands, while chimpanzees are limited to perhaps 50 individuals? It is because our ancestors spent over 100,000 years in populations so small that cooperation was not merely beneficial. It was the sole means of survival. Individuals unable to harmonize with others perished. Those who could share, teach, and work collectively lived long enough to pass on their genes. For 4,000 generations, natural selection was meticulously refining our predisposition for collaboration. Have you ever wondered about our profound inclination towards teaching? Why we dedicate years of our lives to instructing children in tasks that other animals learn through trial and error? It is because during the bottleneck period, the loss of knowledge upon an individual's demise could imperil the entire group. Our ancestors who excelled at imparting information to the subsequent generation possessed enhanced survival prospects over millennia. This engendered the teaching instinct that enables human societies to accumulate knowledge across successive generations. We did not merely survive the bottleneck. We developed an addiction to learning and disseminating our discoveries. Have you ever questioned our remarkable aptitude with tools? Why humans can utilize everything from primitive stone hammers to sophisticated smartphones, while even intelligent animals like dolphins employ tools in only very limited capacities. It is because tool manufacture and utilization were literally life or death skills during those critical years. Individuals who could innovate, who could devise more effective methods for obtaining sustenance, generating fire, or constructing shelter, were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We evolved into a species that perceives the entire world as a repository of resources for problem solving. However, the bottleneck also sheds light on some of our vulnerabilities. Have you ever considered why humans are so susceptible to infectious diseases compared to other mammals? Why viruses that minimally affect other primates can incapacitate us? It is because we experienced a loss of 65% of our genetic diversity during the bottleneck. This included a significant number of immune system variations that might have offered protection against pathogens. We are all considerably more genetically similar than would be expected for a species of our size, which renders us susceptible to diseases that can exploit common genetic weaknesses. Have you ever pondered why genetic disorders, such as sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease, persist within human populations when natural selection should have eradicated them? It is because some of these disorders might have conferred advantages during the bottleneck period, or they could be incidental byproducts of other traits that were favored during that crisis. When a population is reduced to 1,280 individuals, genetic quirks that would typically disappear can become ingrained within the entire species. We bear the indelible marks of near extinction alongside our strengths. But perhaps the most profound implication of this discovery lies in what it reveals about human unity. In the present year, 2025, certain individuals still maintain that racial distinctions among humans hold inherent biological significance. They hold the belief that populations exhibiting superficial differences in appearance or language represent fundamentally distinct human types. The discovery of the bottleneck utterly dismantles such thinking. Every person on Earth, quite literally every single individual, is descended from the same cohort of 1,280 individuals who lived 900,000 years ago. Our divergence has spanned a mere few tens of thousands of years, a negligible period in evolutionary terms. The genetic disparities between any two human populations are less pronounced than the variations observed within a single chimpanzee troop. We are all kin, recent kin. When humans migrated out of Africa 60,000 years ago and dispersed across the globe, they carried bottleneck DNA to every continent. As they developed varied skin pigmentation and facial characteristics to adapt to new climates, they were merely expressing diverse combinations of the same fundamental genetic blueprint. The Aboriginal Australians, who arrived on their continent 50,000 years ago, the Europeans whose ancestors endured the Ice Age, the Polynesians who navigated the Pacific using star charts and woven stick maps, the Native Americans who traversed into the Americas during the last glacial period, all carried genes from those 1,280 survivors. All were products of the same evolutionary crucible. There is no them, there is only us, and us has perpetually been a single family, shaped by the shared history of survival against insurmountable odds. This has significant implications for how we approach contemporary challenges as well. Consider, for example, the current environmental shifts we are experiencing. We are in the midst of another period of accelerated ecological change. While not as extreme as the trials our forebears faced 90,000 years ago, it is nevertheless significant enough to jeopardize the continuity of human society. The revelation regarding the population bottleneck offers us dual grounds for apprehension and optimism. Apprehension, because past ecological catastrophes have pushed human numbers to the very edge of eradication. We are not impervious. Our continued existence is not a given, merely by virtue of our intelligence, but optimism, because we inherit the genetic inheritance of those who ultimately triumphed over adversity. The individuals who navigated the bottleneck were not simply fortunate, they possessed adaptability, ingenuity, and a spirit of collaboration. They were prepared to enact profound alterations to their lifestyles when circumstances necessitated it. These inherent qualities persist within us. The very same adaptability that enabled our ancestors to transition from arboreal existence to life on the plains and subsequently in arid regions. The identical spirit of cooperation that sustained isolated communities through countless centuries of hardship. The comparable capacity for problem solving that spurred the development of novel tools when established methods proved ineffective. We are not the identical species that entered the bottleneck 930,000 years ago. We are the species that emerged from it, tested, refined, and demonstrably capable of enduring conditions that would be fatal to nearly every other large terrestrial creature on the planet. However, survival is not a certainty. It never has been. The researchers responsible for uncovering the bottleneck phenomenon, Wang Zhu, Yuan Pan, Hipeng Li, and their respective teams, have provided us with more than a remarkable scientific insight. They have presented us with a reflection. As we examine the genetic evidence of prolonged periods of near annihilation, we are not solely gaining knowledge of the past. We are gaining self-understanding. We are the species that perseveres, the species that devises means of survival when existence appears improbable, the species that emerges from calamities stronger and more proficient than before. Yet, we are also the species that can experience a 99% reduction in its population and struggle for over 100,000 years, clinging precariously to life before conditions improve. The bottleneck serves as both a cautionary tale and a reassurance. A caution that humanity's ascendancy is never assured, that we have approached oblivion far more closely than most people comprehend, that our current dominion over the globe is not the predetermined outcome of being the preeminent species, but rather the hard-won legacy of ancestors who weathered conditions that annihilated nearly all other life, and a reassurance that within our genetic makeup lies the potential to surmount virtually any obstacle. That we are the descendants of 1,280 individuals who, faced with a disintegrating world around them, resolved to persist. Each instance you resolve a challenge, you are employing faculties honed during the bottleneck. Each time you collaborate with strangers, you are manifesting behavioral patterns that preserved small groups over millennia. Each time you impart knowledge to a child, you are participating in the tradition of information exchange that transmitted vital understanding across 4,000 generations of hardship. The 1,280 endure within us, not symbolically, but literally within our chromosomes, our neural pathways, our inherent resilience. 900,000 years ago, it seemed as though the human chronicle was drawing to a close. The climate had become inhospitable. Most populations had perished. A minute contingent of survivors confronted a world seemingly intent on their destruction. They endured. They adapted. They proliferated. They disseminated across the planet and evolved into us, inhabitants of Earth. We have erected metropolises housing millions.